On April 4, 1922, a group of neighbors forced open the door of an isolated barn in the Bavarian countryside and found 4 bodies stacked on top of each other, hidden under loose straw and a broken door panel. 2 more victims were still inside the farmhouse. All 6 had been struck with the same tool, and for at least 3 days before anyone found them, someone had been living on that farm, sleeping in their beds, eating their food, and feeding their animals, while the bodies lay less than 100 feet away. More than a century later, nobody has ever been charged. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, one of the most documented, most investigated, and least understood unsolved crimes in modern history. The farm itself sat about 70 kilometers north of Munich, in a rural stretch of Bavaria near the small hamlet of Kaifeck. It was isolated by design. The nearest neighbor was a 15-minute walk away, and the property was bordered on multiple sides by dense forest. The family who lived there had a reputation for keeping to themselves, which made the isolation feel less like circumstance and more like a choice. 6 people were living at Hinterkaifeck in March of 1922. Andreas Gruber, 63, ran the farm. His wife, Chilia, was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, lived there with her 2 children, 7-year-old Chilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. A new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had started working at the farm that same day, replacing a previous maid who had quit 6 months earlier. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The previous maid, a woman named Crescens Rieger, left her position claiming the farmhouse was haunted. She told others she had repeatedly heard footsteps in the attic when no one should have been up there, and she developed an overwhelming feeling of being watched inside the house. Andreas Gruber didn't take the claim seriously at the time. He would have reason to reconsider that dismissal within months. In the weeks leading up to the murders, a series of small, strange incidents began stacking up. Gruber found a newspaper from Munich on the property, a paper nobody in the household subscribed to, and nobody could explain the presence of. Around the same time, a set of house keys went missing without explanation. Then came the footprints. Just days before the murders, Gruber told neighbors he'd discovered fresh tracks in the snow, leading from the dense forest bordering the property directly toward the farmhouse. The footprints went one direction only. Nothing led back out. Whoever made them had either walked in and stayed, or found another way to leave without stepping in snow again. Gruber mentioned this to at least one neighbor. Nobody followed up. Nobody investigated. Within days, all 6 residents of the farm would be dead. The murders took place on the night of March 31, 1922. Forensic reconstruction, based on the evidence available at the time, suggests the victims were lured out to the barn individually, rather than attacked together, which is part of why no one inside the house seems to have raised an alarm before it was too late for the others. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy pickaxe-like farm tool, later confirmed to have belonged to the Gruber family itself. It had been taken from their own shed. 4 bodies, Andreas, Chilia, Victoria, and young Chilia, were found stacked together in the barn, covered with straw and a torn wooden door, as though someone had made a token effort to conceal them rather than actually hide them. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, was found dead inside her room in the farmhouse. 2-year-old Joseph was found dead in the house as well. Investigators later noted that Maria appeared to have been killed before she'd even finished settling into a job she'd started only hours earlier that day. When police searched the property, they found something that immediately complicated the working theory of a robbery. Gold coins sat untouched in open drawers. Cash remained stacked on tables in plain view. Whatever motive drove this crime, financial gain doesn't appear to have been part of it. And then investigators found evidence of something far stranger than the murders themselves. For at least 3 days after the killings, someone continued living on the farm. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney on multiple mornings after the murders had already occurred. The cattle were fed. Bread from the kitchen had been eaten. Whoever stayed behaved from the outside, exactly like a member of the household going about an ordinary week. while 6 bodies remained undiscovered on the same property. This detail alone would place Hinterkaifeck among the strangest unsolved cases on record, but the most unsettling discovery came later. During the official investigation of the attic, investigators found that hay in the loft had been matted down into shapes consistent with a person or people lying there for an extended period. Nearby, they found bacon rinds and evidence someone had been eating in that space. Most disturbing of all, 2 sections of roof tiles had been deliberately shifted, creating narrow gaps positioned to give a clear line of sight down into the farmyard and, depending on placement, potentially into parts of the house itself. Whoever did this hadn't simply broken in on the night of the murders. The physical evidence strongly suggests they had been living in that attic, undetected, for an unknown period of time before the killings ever took place. Watching the family's daily routine before acting on it, investigators also reported finding evidence of food waste and human excrement in the same attic space, further supporting the theory of an extended, deliberate stay rather than a single night's intrusion. There was no evidence of forced entry anywhere on the property. Every lock was intact. This detail shaped much of the early investigation, since it suggested the killer either had a key, had been let in willingly, or, as the attic evidence implied, was already inside the house before anyone thought to lock up for the night. Combined with the fact that each victim appeared to have been struck down without a prolonged struggle, investigators at the time theorized that the killer was very likely someone the family recognized and possibly trusted enough not to question their presence on the property. The subsequent investigation was, by most modern standards, a disaster. Word of the murders spread quickly, and in the days following the discovery, hundreds of curious onlookers were allowed to walk through the crime scene before it had been properly secured, contaminating evidence that could never be recovered. The autopsies were conducted on site, in the barn, under primitive conditions, in a decision that reflects the era's investigative practices. More than any specific negligence, Andreas Gruber's head was removed for a phrenological examination, a now discredited practice that attempted to draw conclusions about character from skull shape. Those remains, along with a significant portion of the original case files, were later destroyed when the courthouse storing them was bombed during World War II. The farmhouse itself was demolished the following year, in 1923, largely at the request of surviving relatives who wanted the property erased rather than left standing as a landmark for the curious. During that demolition, workers made 2 more discoveries that hadn't been found during the original search. A mattock, consistent with the murder weapon and stained with what was later confirmed to be dried blood, was found hidden beneath the attic floor. A separate penknife was recovered from the hay in the barn. Neither discovery, made a full year after the murders, ever led to a confirmed suspect. Over the following decades, investigators questioned an extraordinary number of people, by some estimates, more than 100 individual suspects, without ever building a case that led to a formal charge. Several suspects emerged over the following decades. Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, had been reported killed in World War I, though his body was never definitively confirmed, leading to persistent theories that he'd secretly survived and returned to find his wife had moved on, possibly pregnant by another man. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer and the godfather of one of the Gruber children, was investigated and reinvestigated across multiple decades, and remains, to many researchers, the most frequently named suspect, in part due to rumors of an affair with Victoria and speculation about the paternity of her younger child. He was notably one of the first people at the scene after the bodies were discovered, and some investigators found his behavior during questioning inconsistent enough to warrant repeated scrutiny, though nothing was ever proven. Local men with prior burglary records were also questioned, including a pair of brothers with a documented history of minor property crimes in the surrounding area, one of whom, reportedly, asked the former maid unusual personal questions about the family's routines in the months before the murders. None of them were ever formally charged. None of the physical evidence, including the tool believed responsible for the killings, ever definitively tied a single suspect to the crime beyond circumstantial suspicion. In 2007, German police reopened the case using modern forensic methods, working with criminology students to re-examine the surviving evidence. Even with contemporary techniques applied to a century-old file, no new suspect was ever conclusively identified, and no charges were ever filed. The case remains, officially, unsolved. Modern researchers have proposed a range of theories to explain the motive, from a jealous former lover to a targeted act tied to rumors about the family's private life, including persistent speculation regarding Andreas and Victoria's relationship that circulated locally both before and after the murders, but was never substantiated. During the original investigation, these remain theories, repeated often enough over a century to feel like established fact, but none have ever been proven. What remains factual, documented, and undisputed is simpler, and somehow worse. Someone watched this family long enough to learn their exact routines, killed all 6 of them in a single night, without any of them managing to raise a real alarm, and then continued living among the bodies for days afterward, milking the cows and eating their bread, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. More than 100 years later, that person's identity died with them. The Hinterkaifeck farm itself was demolished in 1923, torn down board by board, as if the land could somehow be made to forget what had happened on it. A small memorial now stands near the site, marking the location of a farmhouse that no longer exists, for a family whose final days remain, in the most literal sense, unwitnessed by anyone still able to describe them.